All right, hey, good morning. We're going to get started here, so thanks everyone for coming. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our session sponsor, Metamorphosis, and all of the summit sponsors who are listed in your program and in the slideshow between sessions. The summit would not be possible without their support. This session is approved for continuing legal education credits. Attorneys should have received a CLE form at check-in. Planners, landscape architects, and lead professionals can also receive credit. So see the continuing education table in the foyer for more information. Okay. So welcome, glad to see everyone here. My name is Anna Osland, and I'm the Director of Research at the Kathleen Blanco Public Policy Center at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, which is like a lot of words that you have to string together, but that's how it goes. So I'm excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to introducing our three panelists this morning. First, I have Robert Habens, who is the Chief Economist at the Data Center in Southeast Louisiana, where his work focuses on Greater New Orleans and coastal Louisiana. Second, I have John Benswallow, who's a program officer at the National Academy of Sciences for the Board on Environmental Change and Society. He's also the director of the National Academy's Consensus Study, Managed Retreat in the U.S. Gulf Coast region, which utilizes the lived experience of Gulf Coast residents at risk of climate-induced displacement. And finally, I don't know if I really need to introduce her again. Many of you were at the beginning at our plenary this morning, but I'm going to just go ahead and do it in case people weren't here. A.R. Siders directs the Climate Change Science and Policy Hub at the University of Delaware. She is an associate professor in public policy, marine policy, and geography, and a core member in the Disaster Research Center. And it sounds like maybe a comedian on the side, is that right? Yeah, something like that. Okay. Well, anyway, I'm really excited to see all of you here, and I'm going to pass it to Robert to get us started.
All right, thank you. So I think my job today is to get us started with a little bit of data on migration. That won't be a surprise if you see the name of my organization, the Data Center. I'm going to start very high level and then kind of narrow it down to talk about migration responses to flooding in Louisiana. Okay, so here's the situation. The state of Louisiana has lost population every year since 2016. And when we look at population change, there's basically four things that go into it: births, deaths, in-migration, and out-migration. The birth rate has been declining as the population ages. Louisiana, may or may not surprise you to hear, has the 8th highest age-adjusted mortality rate in the country, so that's kind of baked into this number here. But I think that probably what we're here to talk about today is net migration. Now, there were 15 states that had negative net migration between 2020 and 2023, and out of those 15, Louisiana ranks 6th. Migration is a churn. That means people are coming and going, and what this essentially means is that for every 10 people that moved away from Louisiana and went to another state, only 7 people came back to replace them. So that's kind of the question, is why has the balance tipped toward negative over recent years? Now, zooming in a little bit to the local level, of the 64 parishes in Louisiana, in recent years, only 12 of them have gained population, and most of those have gained only a little bit of population. But most of the population gain around the state has been in sort of like suburban areas around our metropolitan areas, places like Livingston and Ascension Parish, St. Tammany Parish, the Youngsville area of Lafayette. So we have this very uneven pattern of population change in the state. Now, why do people move? The number one reason is jobs related, and the number two reason is family related. So I'm going to talk about jobs for a little bit. This is a trend that shows employment in the state of Louisiana in blue, and then for comparison, it shows the United States in red. And if you, it starts in 2001, and if you look from 2001 to 2015, that's a long time. That's 15 years. During that period, we had the Great Recession and we had the 2005 hurricanes. And despite that, that the state of Louisiana was pretty much keeping pace with employment growth at the national level. But then in 2015, we've kind of fallen off that. And since then, we've had essentially no employment growth. You can see that big dip from COVID at the end of the chart. The question is, why have we, for the past few years, failed to keep pace with the nation? Well, around that time was when we had a collapse in oil prices. Certainly that's part of the equation here. But then, and I'm kind of zooming in a little bit further because we're going to want to kind of paint between the lines of why migration is a bit of a complex thing to talk about. So these are, similar charts, but we're looking here at the Houma-Thibodaux metro area and the Lake Charles metro area. And you see that these are two local areas that are sensitive to conditions in the oil industry, but sensitive in very different ways. And that's why they went on different trajectories. But we also see the effect of recent disasters in both of these regions. And that's why it becomes a bit difficult to kind of tease out these trends in our state, because we have certain economic factors that are in some ways relatively unique to our state and set us apart from the nation. But we also have these, I think we've heard the billion-dollar disasters mentioned a few times in this conference, and we also have exposure to that here. Last thing, again, just talking about the complexity of migration. I think we hear about these disasters, we hear about increasing climate risk. We might expect more people to be moving, but in fact, both in Louisiana and in the United States, people are moving at historically low and in fact declining rates. So that's just a bit about migration. I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about a little bit more specifically about responses to flooding. Now, we've already kind of talked about how migration is a complex thing with many drivers, but there are a lot of planning decisions that could benefit from information that links local population change, as we see on this map, with the kind of maps that I think probably most of us in this room have seen many times that kind of illustrate the extent of climate risk and flood risk in particular that parts of our state experience. So, given the data that we have, it's difficult to tease out these trends. There's actually very little data on migration, and migration is a very complex thing. So one thing that we've been trying to do with our recent research is, I'm just going to skip that one, is to develop a way of measuring residential address changes. And it's a little bit experimental, but in doing this, we kind of overcome some of the limitations in available data. And what we end up is we see this kind of spike in address changes that occurs almost immediately after a move. And it looks kind of like the chart on the left there. So if we measure these spikes and we kind of look and see how they vary across different areas, we see that it varies a lot from storm to storm, for one. That might not be a surprise. For example, Katrina had a very large effect on moves. But they vary also by level of income. Places with low income tend to have higher address changes after a flood event. Places with a large amount of renters tend to have a lot of address changes after a flood event. And perhaps more interestingly, if we look at persistent moves, and this we measure in terms of people who move away and stay away for a protracted period of time. They don't move back, for example, after their home has been repaired. The initial address change is pretty comparable if we look at Louisiana and compare it with other Gulf Coast states, but the rate of persistent moves appears to be much higher in Louisiana, and it's probably due to these underlying factors. The question, where do these people go when they move? Again, Katrina is a bit of an outlier, but if we look at the patterns of, do people stay in their same parish, move to other parts of the state, and so on, it actually, what we see is that people tend to move to places that they were moving to already. And this is kind of consistent with the idea that, that disasters usually accelerate changes that are already happening in communities. So there's just more moves, but they go to more or less the same places. So we also look at responses to risk. This is kind of a bit different from responses to specific disaster events. And in some ways, I think it's probably more relevant to the question of planning, because we want to be sort of proactively adapting to risk rather than responding to disasters. If we look at people who moved from communities in Louisiana that have high levels of risk, this is where they tended to move to. And I think we see a lot of things in this chart. We maybe see a little bit of the proverbial move inland or move up the bayou that I think I wouldn't be surprised we hear a bit about that from the other panelists. But we also see, again, growth in suburban areas and growth in places that were growing already. So a lot of, if there are people moving away from risky areas, it's probably to a lot of places that people were moving to already. Again, kind of teasing out that a little bit more, the chart on the left here is kind of hypothetical. If people are moving away from risk, we would expect to see something that looks kind of like this chart, where we have higher rates of in-migration and lower out-migration in areas that have lower risk, whereas in areas that have higher risk, we have more out-migration and less in-migration. If we just look at the raw data, it's a lot more ambiguous than that, but that's not really surprising because there's a lot of factors that affect migration. But, and this is what we do in the chart on the right, if we adjust for a lot of the characteristics of communities that affect rates of migration, we see this kind of upside down U shape. And I know it's probably a lot going on there, but basically what the chart says is that the places with the least flood risk are actually seeing less in migration than places with moderate to major flood risk. And we do see this marginal negative effect on migration once we get to extreme levels of flood risk. And that's going to be, probably the coastal communities. But a lot of the population growth is actually occurring in places with relatively high risk. And I think that kind of came out in some of the lecture this morning and the comments that followed. So I think we're seeing it with this, relatively well-controlled estimate of these patterns within our state. So that's all I have in terms of data. I'll just close with one thought. It's really difficult to put a number on climate migration. I think we've kind of attempted to do that a little bit with our research. But I think the real question, the bigger question, is about how climate adaptation interacts with multiple forms of mobility. And mobility is dictated by factors related to the economy and other things. Demographic and economic factors are going to continue to drive these longer trends. And then when we look at trends that occur in smaller areas, it's also going to continue to be, for example, segregation by race and income, the factors that give rise to uneven place-based opportunity structures from community to community that are probably going to continue to be the driving factors in migration in our state. One of the interesting things we found with our data, for example, is that for people who move, they were actually 3 times more likely to make a move that preserves racial segregation than reduces racial segregation. So I think, if anything, I think I'm encouraging a look at kind of a holistic view of migration that takes into account the various factors that shape it. And I look forward to hearing more about that from the other panelists. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's an honor to be on a panel with people at the top of their field. So thank you for the CPEX for putting this together. My name is John Bensualo, and this presentation is about a report that was released in January by the National Academy of Sciences. It's a pre-publication right now. We expect to have a hard copy by the end of May. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process of doing the study and then a little bit about the specifics of the report. But it's going to be pretty high level. Starting at the bottom of the slide, the effort was funded by the Gulf Research Program, which is an internal division of the National Academies, and they were founded on funds from the criminal lawsuit for the companies responsible for the Deepwater Horizon disaster, and they have a large portfolio of projects ranging from offshore energy safety. This particular one came out of their Gulf Health and Resilience Board. The project was staffed by the Board on Environmental Change in Society, where I'm a program officer. That board is within the Social Science and Education Division at the academies. And our mission in that board is to marshal the social and behavioral sciences to identify equitable solutions to challenges at the intersection of environmental change and society. But we are inherently interdisciplinary, and our board is composed of people across the scientific domains. We stood the committee up for this study in March of 2022, so about 2 years ago. And the transition to community-driven relocation from managed retreat is for several reasons. Most frankly, Americans don't like to be managed or retreat. But also, at a more fundamental level, the committee really wanted to center communities in the decision-making processes about relocation. And for some people that we engaged in the Gulf region, it indexed historical forced displacements like the Trail of Tears and others. Finally, we did this as an attempt to align with ongoing terminology at the federal level. So there's a community-driven relocation subcommittee of 13 or 14 agencies that is being chaired by the DOI and FEMA. So by utilizing this term, we're trying to normalize it in the sort of climate change and adaptation and resilience discussions. And also elevate relocation as a viable adaptation strategy for communities that wish to move. Just briefly, this is a very condensed version of our study statement of task. It would be about 3 or 4 slides, but mainly the study is about the movement and relocation of people, infrastructure, and communities away from environmentally high-risk areas. Again, sometimes people call it managed retreat. And it did focus on the Gulf region, but the recommendations and the conclusions could be extrapolated nationally and to other regions as well. So a little bit about the study process. This is a snapshot of our outreach and engagement activities, which included all 5 Gulf Coast states in a variety of ways, from the metropolises of the Tampa Bay area to Houston, to smaller cities like the environmental justice community of Port Arthur, and also Homa and Thibodaux, as well as some virtual engagements with communities at the Mississippi, Alabama Gulf Coast. And again, these were chosen just for a diversity of both demographics and hazard profiles. Here I'd like to mention that as a national organization, participation at National Academies workshops generally include quote-unquote stakeholders from particular sectors, but the committee for this study felt that it was critical to really engage everyday residents that are on the front lines of these issues and impacts. Yet to do so equitably would require compensation for childcare, transportation, leaving their subsistence and commercial activities, et cetera. Without too much detail, staff found a workaround by hiring local community-based organizations as consultants and stipulating in their contracts that they would in turn identify, recruit, and compensate people for their efforts. Here are just a couple of pictures of the workshops we held. Most of these were in the summer of 2022. And so we were able to engage people, again, at the residential level, a lot of whom had never heard of us before, but we leaned on the existing trust that was established by the community-based organizations, and they also created a safe environment at these workshops by attending and serving in moderating roles. So we did a series of these activities called community testimonials. So people shared very difficult stories about relocation and other climate change impacts, and these worked their way into the report. So there's 40 or 50 stories that we call testimonials, large block quotes, and these really drove and supported the conclusions and recommendations in the report. So in a way, the study process was a very community-driven one. This is a snapshot of the report, which is a tome of some 500 pages. So we've broken it into 3 parts, and I'll just give you a real high-level summary of it. The first part is really a justification for the study, looking at the scale of the threat of climate impacts and displacement in the Gulf region. And we also showcase lots of examples of relocation to show that it really isn't that radical of an adaptation strategy, but it's been happening for over 100 years, going back to the late 1800s, and up to more emblematic cases like the Isle de Jean Charles, Newtok, Alaska, and we also have some international examples from Australia and Japan. At the same time, civil society and government are still very challenged to do this relocation in an equitable and community-driven way. So rather than dictating step by step what needs to happen, Part 2 really looks at all the considerations that need to go into the planning process. So some of those include, again, the historical context of displacements in the region, the histories of other climate adaptation and resilience activities and their outcomes and who was involved. We spent a lot of time talking about place attachment and its cultural and economic dimensions. That's a real challenge for people that live in particular ecologies to try and replicate that somewhere else. So as Rob mentioned, a lot of times it is up the bayou, especially in Louisiana, to try and remain connected to those activities. We also talk a good bit about well-being and centering it in climate adaptation strategies and conversations and engagement. So everything from fortifying social capital that can better lead to collective efficacy so people can be healthy enough to participate in these discussions in an effective way. And then that part ends on receiving communities, which got short shrift in this because the committee felt that it really deserves a whole new study. It's a very, very critical part of the relocation cycle. And so we touch on it, but we're looking forward to when that study happens. And finally, Part 3 really gets into the granular of the policy, funding, and planning landscape, how we can innovate that, and it ends on a series of 13 recommendations on how to do that, that identify numerous federal agencies, as well as other jurisdictions and regional entities. So just to give you a snapshot of the recommendations, we grouped them into 3 different domains. So again, centering well-being addresses the inherent interconnections between community resilience, climate adaptation, and individual and community well-being. The second set of recommendations is about developing and sustaining local collaboration, so really moving across jurisdictions and thinking about community capacity along the way. And then finally, the third one, third domain of recommendations really focuses on federal agency preparations, include things like hazard mitigation navigators, which kind of builds off of the extension model that Sea Grant institutions use. And also really reassessing the benefit cost analysis processes. We don't have a great answer for that, but part of that is also about streamlining funding and interagency collaborations to make it easier for communities to apply for funding for relocation. I just wanted to, we have way too many recommendations to go through. I just wanted to put a few up that had to do with planning. And so this one really is about the lack of proactive planning across scales. So including thinking about management of vacant land after people do relocate. Recommendation 5 is about federal agencies engaging, again, with other jurisdictions, with regional planning entities and communities themselves, to work with both originating and what we call originating and receiving communities, to establish things like thresholds for consolidation, share data about priority receiving communities, the impacts of regional population shifts, and to modify, again, federal grant making for things like including programming of open space as an eligible FEMA-funded activity, among others. And then the last two that really focus on planning, again, are recommendations 6 and 7. So again, this is about cross-scale collaboration. I don't think I'll stop there. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
All right. I want to reframe the way we think about retreat a little bit. And we can say relocation or retreat. The terminology does matter. I tend to say managed retreat because I think that's what we actually do in the US, and it's like the most specific. But I think there's a lot of benefit in using terms that the community wants to use when you're doing community engagement. So, but before I start thinking about reframing it, just to give some very broad overgeneralizations about what retreat looks like across the United States right now. So we have sort of unmanaged, unplanned retreat, which is where people just move on their own. And that's happening all the time, sometimes for flood-related reasons or climate change-related reasons, as Robert pointed out, a lot of times not, right? So for moving for very many reasons. Sometimes that means other people are moving into those homes and coming back in, and sometimes those means those homes are just abandoned. So a decade after Katrina hit New Orleans, there were 40,000 abandoned homes, roughly. Someone from New Orleans here probably has better data on that. And I know that's not all just because 40,000 people walked away from their homes, but just using it to illustrate the idea that sometimes unmanaged retreat just looks like people leaving. Yeah. So we have unmanaged and unplanned retreat happening. We have community relocations, which there are many, and we have historically, lots of examples historically of this happening, but where like a whole community picks up and leaves together, or part of the community, say the business district or a major residential district, moves together as a community. Yeah, don't take photos of these are the wrong answers. I mean, go ahead, but just so you know, these are the things I'm going to suggest that you don't think about retreat. Yeah, I should probably get to that slide faster. Sorry, I was just like, I see you. All right, so we have unmanaged retreat, we have community relocation, and then we have buyouts, which are what I've done a lot of studying on is buyouts. And so buyouts are one of the primary way, they are the primary way that the US does relocation to date, which is basically this: a disaster happens, your home is flooded, the local government says, we'd like to help people sell their homes. They ask the feds for money, usually FEMA or HUD, sometimes Army Corps or small business or ag. Anyway, if they give money, the local government then comes and says, would you like to sell your home? You say yes or no. If you say yes, I say, great, here's your check. You go somewhere. I have no idea where. I demolish the home, and it becomes a vacant lot. That's the general pattern. Now, there are improvements on that pattern, where like maybe I do know where you go, and you moved somewhere safe. Maybe we did do something good with that land, but they're the exception, not the rule. And as you can imagine, there are demographic reasons why some communities have better land use after buyouts than others. Yeah, so wealthier places tend to turn those lands into community gardens or parks or something beneficial for the community. And communities that don't have resources to do that, they become vacant lots. And they just stay there. Maybe they get mowed, maybe they don't. They're just empty space. So there are a ton of other ways that managed retreat can be done and has been done in small pockets, right? So people have done and can do things like life estates. So you don't move out today, but I buy your home, I'm the government, I buy your home, you live there for the rest of your life, and then when you die or you decide to move out, then I get your home. We can do leasebacks and buybacks where I buy your home and you rent it to you or to someone else. Yeah. There are other things where we can do nudges to get out. There can be forcible. Houston is now experimenting with mandatory buyouts and has a long history of using eminent domain to take homes out of floodplains as well. So there are a lot of other ways that can be done, but the primary ways are just those few tools that are happening. And this is a big problem because a lot of you in the Q&A session are probably going to ask things like, what works best? And I'm going to say, wow, I really wish I knew. But in the absence of knowing things like where people go to the well-being point, right? Are they doing better or not? I don't know. How is the land used? I don't know. What policies led to better outcomes? I don't know. And I really wish I did. But we have like 2 decades of research on this and a few dozen studies that don't cover many of these examples and don't answer many of these questions. And so a lot of this is a giant unknown, which makes your committee's problem, which is one of the challenges I know you encountered, that is like figuring out what works the best in these areas. But I want to think about some reframes. Okay, to get to this slide, I want to think about some reframes that help with some of this, because a lot of times when we talk about retreat, people have these things in their heads where they're thinking about retreat as something that has to happen today. So we're going to retreat today or we're never going to retreat. Yeah. I mean, yeah, and as soon as I say it like that, it sounds silly. But we have that mindset where we think that retreat is either something we're going to do or not going to do, and we're going to make that decision, and then that's it, and then we're done. We think it's something that's going to happen one time. I'm going to offer these buyouts, and then we're never going to come back and revisit that issue. And you can see this because we talk about things like a checkerboarding problem, where I buy out a home, I don't buy out a home, I buy out a home, I don't buy out a home, and it means that I have a checkerboard, right? I have an open space, a house, an open space, a house. And this is only a problem if you think that you will never come back and offer a buyout again. Yeah? But because we do, we tend to think about this as a one-time action, a one-time thing that will be done. We have these concerns. We tend to think about this as something that's going to be disaster-driven, so that we're going to do this relocation because there's going to be a big storm or a big flood, and that is suddenly magically going to make everyone want to move. As Robert pointed out, right, like people move for a lot of reasons that are not environmental. In fact, if you rank the reasons that people migrate, climate change is usually right at the bottom, even if they live in an area that is very flood-prone. It's because, think about where you live, yeah? Was flooding first on your mind? I mean, hopefully it was on the list, but probably things like commute, school districts, the price, the size of the home, distance to family, those things probably were really big factors, probably way bigger factors than the flood. And so all of those things are going to come together and be a much bigger issue than just the disaster. I also hear this myth that people don't want to move, right? And it's true that some people don't. Some people will never want to move. They're going to live there in that house until the day they die. Cool. A lot of other people do move. Yeah? Across the United States, roughly 30% of people live in their hometowns. That means that 70% moved. And we're open to the idea of moving. Yeah? Actually, Abby Hotard, who's going to be at the University of South Alabama, has done a survey in New Orleans and in Houston, and she found, interestingly, that 78% of people, or 73% of people were open to moving, and 78% of people were open to taking a buyout, especially if they saw a flood again. So that was a limited sample. It's probably not everyone, right? Maybe they're thinking that, that this is sort of, that will never actually happen, so it's not really a problem. I can say, sure, I'd take the buyout until that day happens. But there's a lot more appetite than we think. Interviewing 36 practitioners around the US who are running buyouts, all of them have waiting lists. All of them have more people who want to be bought out, who want to get out of the floodplain than they have money to buy out. So when we say it's not desired, sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. And then we tend to think about it as though we're only going to do those tools that I talked about. Okay, now these are the right answers. So instead of that, I think we need to be thinking about this as a process, something that's going to happen. So it's not just, are we going to do retreat or are we not? Right? You're all planners. You're thinking about, well, we're going to invest in new housing over here, and we're going to not invest in as much housing over here. And over time, I mean, I like to pick on New York City, right? So like New York City, I think should relocate. Yeah, no, I'm not even joking. Is it going to do it in the next year? No. The next decade? No. But over the next 100 years, do I think it is sensible for New York to acquire and invest in infrastructure in the Bronx and north and west of the city, right? To invest in new infrastructure, to maybe put a new airport or think about infrastructure that is not below sea level rise, right? So over the next 100 years, right, you can imagine New York City amoeba-like shifting 2 miles north. Over the last 100 years, it changed a lot. So over the next 100 years, I think it could do the same thing. And if we start thinking about retreat like that, if we start thinking about it as a process, like an amoeba filing, as opposed to a pick up and relocate, it changes the whole way we think about that process and the whole way we think about what's possible. Also, if we start thinking about other drivers in these areas. And I don't want to do too much on this, but just a few options. So one thing I think about a lot is this, people who don't want to move. I think it's great. If we can convince some people to move, great. But there's a lot of reasons people don't want to move. And I actually don't think that when we think about retreat, we need to convince people to move. I don't think that's the goal, right, to reframe the problem. The problem isn't how do we convince them to move. I think the problem is how do we help them make informed choices now, right? So they really know about the risk that they are taking on and what that means for them, and that they'd be taking on for their families, for their jobs, for everything else. How do we make informed choices now? And then how do we make sure that they have options if and when they want to leave? Maybe it makes sense for them to stay now, but they don't want to be there in 20 years when the flooding gets much worse. How do we make sure that when that happens 20 years from now, there's a way out? Yeah? Because sometimes it's like, oh, well, you know, we have to convince these people to leave. And I'm like, no, the ocean will do that for me. I just have to wait. The ocean will convince people to move. Yeah? But what I need to do is make sure that they have options to get out and that they're not suffering along the way. And I think that goes back to this idea of it being process, right? And that is a very different problem to solve than going in and trying to convince a bunch of people to move tomorrow. I think it's a much easier problem, but we'll see. And then the other thing I want to think about is Louisiana, right? People have a lot of ties here to jobs, right? A lot of the jobs here are geographically constrained, oil and gas, right? Our fisheries based on the coasts, and we need a working coast. And that is true. I would like you to imagine, though, imagine a future, say, 50 years from now, where the US has, say, to try to stop climate change, shifted away from oil and gas. And the oil and gas industry is shrinking. Maybe it's not gone, maybe it's shrinking, which means that those jobs are shrinking. The wetlands have been lost because Louisiana is losing wetlands fast and probably will lose them faster in the future, which means that the fisheries industry is shrinking. The fisheries industry, I've been told, is preparing for a collapse of the crab industry. So as it thinks about that, so if you imagine, and those are climate related, but they're not floods, they're not a Katrina, they're not a hurricane. Yeah. So what are the other climate-related issues we should be thinking about from economic, demographic, other issues that would incentivize people to move, right? Or have them have fewer options to stay? And how do we prepare for those? How do we think for that future that isn't just about preparing for the next hurricane, but is thinking about these bigger picture social issues? And how do we create those pull factors? How do we create a other place in New Orleans where people want to go, where it has benefit to go, right? Where there is the new school, there's the new hospital, there's the new employment business district. There's something that people want more than they want to live in a floodplain. I think that's it. I'll just stop with two things I think we need are, we're talking about cathedral building as this mindset of we need to build things that we will not be around to see. I want to plan for a future that I might not be around. I want to plan for a 2100 that is amazing and that I will not see, barring major advances in medical science. I want to plan that because I want my nieces and nephews and their kids to have an amazing future, and other people who I'm not related to. Yeah? I want to build something bigger than my own lifetime. And that means that I'm going to have to think bigger, but it also means that I'm going to have to trust and train a next generation to be able to pick up on what I'm doing and put in the groundwork. So it doesn't mean that I have to build everything today, and it doesn't mean I should be limited by what I can do today. It means that I should think about how I am laying the foundation for someone to do something else in the future to advance towards that something better. And to do that, we need all the tools in the toolbox. And that is why retreat needs to be part of the conversation, or relocation. And that is why all the forms of retreat and relocation need to be part of the conversation, not just the ones that we have used to date. Thanks.
Come back over here. Aha, it's on. All right. So 3 great presentations here this morning, and just as we think about kind of what our panel is telling us, what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of data out there, and it doesn't always point to migration being caused by thinking about climate change, which is a little crazy. So that gives us an opportunity as planners to really think about what are the other pieces of the puzzle and how we can influence that. So thinking about the sense of place that we're building in communities and how we can leverage that as a way of thinking about relocation. Migration is one piece of the puzzle. And I think from my standpoint, hearing this, there's a lot of questions that come to my mind about, how do we bring in the voices of folks that are either in receiving or donating communities, and the people that are moving themselves, as well as how we as planners really think about what needs to happen in the future and what that future will look like. So I have lots and lots of questions and could dominate this entire panel here with just my questions. But we're going to open it up to the audience and try and hear what kind of questions you have. And if you don't have any, I've got lots. So do we have microphones out there? Okay, great. So raise your hand if you have questions, and they'll come around with the microphone.
It's a very broad question in the sense that in the next 50 years, do you have any idea in general terms of how many people we're talking about being affected by the need to move?
Okay, so if you didn't hear it, he's asking about how many people in the next 50 years will be impacted by the need to move. And so I would say that that's a pretty big question, and it includes both the people that potentially move and the receiving community. So Robbie, what you got?
Yeah, I think that there is some information out there. In a sense, that's one thing we were trying to look at with our study because it was intended to be of use to the coastal master plan, which does a lot of projection out to 50 years. And it would be very helpful to know how the population might change. I'll just say that it's very difficult to know because there are so many changes. For example, my day job is as an economist, and if somebody asked me like what the economy is going to look like in the next 10 years, I would have a hard time answering them, and I would encourage them to be very skeptical on anybody who told them definitively what was going to happen with the economy. So that's just an example. There's many factors, and it's hard to project over time. There have been a lot of studies that look, for example, at one kind of exposure, which is chronic inundation due to sea level rise. And sometimes the numbers that come out of those studies are very large. But I think that as the climate migration field matures, we're kind of looking at multiple exposures and taking seriously the complexity of migration. So as anybody who lives in Louisiana knows, it's like your house doesn't have to be chronically inundated for you to think about wanting to move. Right? We're exposed to wind events, we're exposed to flood events. Maybe the economy's not so great. It's all these things kind of working together. So that unfortunately, I think all we can say is that that's a worthy question and one that people are working on and will be working on it for years. But I don't know that there's a very definitive answer to it yet.
Maybe just ballpark. You're a data person, so maybe you're less willing to ballpark than I am. So ballpark, right? Because I've seen national numbers. I don't know Louisiana numbers, but national numbers seem to be something like 4 to 13 million might be inundated permanently by the end of the century, depending on sea level rise. And one estimate is 41 million Americans are currently exposed to flooding. So something in that ballpark might be. But as you pointed out, right, there's big error bars on those, and there's big error bars on those because, well, how aggressively are we going to try and stop climate change? How rapidly is the sea level going to rise? The flooding issue is going to happen. How much new housing are we going to continue to build in these flood-prone areas, right? How many seawalls are we going to build? Because you probably only relocate if you don't build a levee or elevate the home or something else like that. So where are you going to build the seawalls, and are you going to protect other places or not? Right? And then what's the economy going to do, and how those other demographics are going to change? And so there's giant error bars on that, but I'd put something around those numbers. And just a number I use to put that in perspective is that those are really big numbers. On the other hand, something like 25 to 30 million Americans moved last year, and every year. So by the end of the century, we might need to move the same number of people who move annually in the US. And so that is both a big problem and also not. Like depending on when they move and like, right, do all 40 million people move tomorrow? That's a big deal. Do they all move to Des Moines, Iowa? That's a big deal. Yeah. But if they move piecemeal, right, 10,000 people a year for the next 80 years, that's a rounding error. Yeah. So a lot of this depends on the timing things as well. Sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just know sometimes I feel like
I didn't know the numbers, so thank you for telling me.
You're good. I thought you were just hedging on there, like I don't want to commit to something. They're going to quote you with.
Yeah, and I like that because I like thinking about like the amoeba-like scooch, just like to your neighbor community. Like, does that really count as a move if you're just inching away at a little piece at a time? So, other questions from the audience? Yes, we've got one here in the middle, or wherever you can get the microphone to. Oh, you've got it in the back. All right, let's go.
Here's a very real scenario, right? You want people to move proactively, and when they move, they have to sell their place, right? They're not just moving and leaving it there without being compensated for it. So here's a very real situation that happened to us. We moved to Houston for 7 years, moved back to Louisiana because we love it here, family's here. Bought a house in 2011 or so that had flooded with 2 inches of water in like 1990. We took the risk. It was a 4-bedroom house. We have too many kids. That's what we needed. It was affordable. Fast forward to 2016, 4.5 feet or so of water in the house. So as a planner, landscape architect, I got involved in the repetitive loss program, knowing that house needed to come down, right? That's the right thing to do. There's 12 houses along that bayou. pretty much all of us ended up getting into the program. None of those houses ended up following through with the program. And the resulting reasons for that is you get to the end, the finish line, and FEMA performs a appraisal process. Well, those appraisals weren't in line with actual appraisals. There was no way to fight it or argue it. Did our own appraisal, it came in $25,000 higher than their appraisal. Repetitive loss program gives you 90% of the appraised value. There's other people that want to buy your house at your appraised value because they also can't find a house big enough for their families. It's worth the risk. And at that point, it's a hard decision as, father, family member, like, do we take a loss on the house we bought, or do we find a way to at least recoup our money knowing that we've already lost everything that was in the house? So in my situation, against my better judgment, we listed it for sale. Somebody came in and purchased it. We ended up breaking even on the house, only losing the contents of it. And somebody else, is living there today. All 12 of those houses that flooded, none of them ended up following through. Everybody followed that process. So it's a fundamental policy error from the top down. It's not, I knew better. I talked to neighbors. Everybody in that neighborhood was educated. There was doctors, lawyers, but everybody's financially conscious, right? Like, you don't want to take a loss of 20 to 25%. Nobody in their right mind does that.
So it sounds like you're talking about like the discrepancy between federal, local, and like the reality of the real estate market. AR, do you want to just talk a little bit about how some of those like incremental decisions can have an impact long term?
Yeah, so thanks for sharing that story, and it's unfortunately an all too common scenario. Yeah, and so a couple things. Many buyout programs are funded by FEMA or HUD, and it sounds like you were in a very particular one, but many of those are then administered by local governments. And so the local governments can actually make decisions. So for example, I know of other buyout programs where if your appraisal comes in at, say, anywhere up to $50,000 more than what FEMA's or the governments came in at, they will automatically approve it. They will only have to do some kind of retrofit or blah, blah, blah if like yours came in at something astronomically more. So there are programs that have tried to solve the exact problems you're having. But this is a big challenge. One of my favorite studies in this area is titled Historical Look at Buyout Programs. Are we learning or just failing? Spoiler alert, we are not learning. Yeah? And it's because, we have roughly 1,200 counties across the United States have used buyout programs. That's in every single state. And it's roughly 1 in 3 counties, yeah? And the evidence that those counties are learning from what other counties are doing to improve their administration of this program is zilch. Yeah? And this is a real problem. This program's been running for 30 years, and we have very little evidence of improvement over time. And there's a lot of advocates for improvement over time. So things like, we should be paying more than fair market value. We should be giving an appraisal of the home that is not based on the value of the home, but is based on the value of the home if it were not in a floodplain, because we know that being in the floodplain could depress the price. Or we should not be offering fair market value. We should be offering what it would cost you to buy a comparable home outside the floodplain, which might be a very different price than what you paid for that home. Yeah. And if any of those options, actually I'm working with economists now who are saying, hey, in agriculture, when they do buyouts, they have a totally different market where you basically say to them, here's what it would take for you to buy me out. So you give them a price as opposed to them telling you a price. Yeah. So there's all different kinds of mechanisms that the program could be using to overcome those kinds of challenges. And the challenge we face now is to figure out which of those work most consistently, which of those work in which contexts, and then to try to spread the word, right? And to show and to help people to learn from what has already been done as opposed to reinventing the wheel every time. Because yeah, the challenges you're facing are real. I think they are solvable, and I think some places have solved them, but it's distributing those solutions and figuring out the limits, right? That maybe they work in your context, or maybe they don't. Maybe they work in that program, maybe they don't. But I think that learning is going to be a really big piece of this.
I love that idea of like learning from what we're doing. It's so brilliant.
Well, it's Camille's original quote, right? That we have to learn, relearn, and unlearn from Toffler. Yeah.
Yeah, so speaking of learning from communities, John Ben, are there any insights from the listening tour that you went on that you think would be relevant to this as we think about how we learn from challenges like I couldn't get the right price to let my house be bought out, as we're thinking about broadly what communities need to do? Are there thoughts that you have on that from listening to communities across the Gulf Coast? You're on.
Yeah, thanks. A whole bunch of thoughts. I mean, the main message of our report is that people need to be involved in the decision-making processes about these things, and there's a lot of lack of effective engagement, even around buyouts. People can't get the material in the right language, for example, or they just don't know, and there's a lot of fear around someone moving in, even though that can't always happen. There's a lot of fear, which shows you that people don't know what the rules are, and there's a lot of learning that needs to happen at the public level. And thinking of something else, that there's a lot of silos too, and this idea of relocation is going to take it's going to have to be a regional approach, and there's people that just aren't in conversation. So even though we call it originating and receiving communities, there's a whole lot that has to happen in between both of those. And I think a regional coordination would be a good place to start.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I love that. And we know how challenging that can be as planners. So we're going to toss it back out as a planner thinking about that. What other questions do you have?
Hey, good morning. Liz Russell, great to see all of you. Hi. So I really appreciate this conversation, and I really appreciate all the work that you guys are doing on a regular basis. Thank you for your leadership. I feel like a lot of this conversation is about the community-based and non-governmental or public sector responses to this reality. And in Louisiana, we're increasingly aware of the private sector responses to this reality, especially around the state's insurance crisis and the insurance markets adjusting for disaster and climate risk increasing. But I guess I want to ask, kind of in the context of both policy and the sort of shifting private sector landscape, are you seeing examples of regulatory or statutory shifts that understand the way that the private sector is influencing public sector response over time? I just am conscious of how many of us in Louisiana might be unable to sell our homes or purchase a home long before there's water lapping at the doorstep because of lack of availability of insurance or the availability to not get a mortgage over time, those kinds of things. And so I just want to ask about that interplay.
Yeah, so that's a great question, thinking about insurance, especially in changes with risk rating 2.0. I know Louisiana is deep in the weeds with those discussions at the federal level. Do one of you want to take on this question to talk about the private sector? You're going to go
I'll
for
say
it?
anything.
Okay,
All right. Okay. Have I seen any good regulatory legislative shifts on this? No. No. So the only thing I've seen are basically, let's see, California, did Florida pass as well, a moratorium saying like, hey, insurance companies, you can't pull out, you can't stop issuing policies in our state. I think the response that we are seeing in this area, that I have been seeing in this area, seems to be moving more towards making the private sector public, right? I think we're moving towards more publicly subsidized insurance, or we're moving a model where we just stop calling it insurance and just give government, right, like responses payouts. So I think we're moving in that direction, which I think is a problem. I think people recognize that it's a problem, but all I've seen so far are sort of moratoria or something to try to put a pause on the private industry taking action before the public can sort that out. considering that we're on our, does anyone know what, 27th reauthorization of the National Flood Insurance Program? This number's probably wrong, but we're in the 20s anyway. I am concerned about how long it's going to take for the public sector to catch up on those issues. But yeah, no, I think you're raising a really important issue on the private sector. It's another big source of uncertainty in all of this. And I actually think it's one of the big reasons that we need to be thinking about retreat as having options, right? Because to your point on like, what are you going to do in that scenario, right? Do you sell to someone else? Like you think it's kind of unethical. I kind of do too. Like it's concerning. I'm not judging you for that decision. I just meant that like, there's reasons you had qualms about doing that, right? And I think a lot of people do. That's concerning. But then if you can't afford it, right, what else do you do? And I think on some level, right, having a backstop that is not, we're going to come in and make it okay, but that we're going to come in and help you get out might be at least, maybe it's not the answer, but I feel like it has to be part of the answer. So I actually think the insurance sector goes part and parcel with the buyout as giving people options. Not all the options on the table are going to be amazing. I just want to make sure that there are several to choose from. But it's kind of a cop-out answer. I wish I had something better.
I think that's a great answer, and I think that also speaks to some of the things that Robert brought up about the complexity of the reasons that people make decisions about moving. So it might not just be insurance, but it's insurance plus changing schools, or it's insurance plus this, plus this, plus this. So it's like a multifaceted challenge that individuals have to make as they make decisions about where to live. And we, in Louisiana, we have very sticky zip codes, so people like to live here. They like to stay close to their families. They like to stay close to their community. And how does that change? That's, the private sector is just one piece of that larger puzzle of the decisions that people are making. So, other questions? What do we got out there?
All right. John, in your presentation, you mentioned a recommendation around providing or FEMA potentially including funding for the programming of open space as part of relocation. And I'm really curious if you've seen any sort of examples of how that kind of programming has helped people adjust to relocation or sort of address some of the place attachment challenges that you spoke about.
Just to make sure, it was the place attachment or the funding of open spaces and vacant places?
Well, I guess I was curious about the intersection of it, but more so on the programming of open space.
Programming of open space. Yeah. Well, I don't know a lot about that. I haven't seen a lot of examples, but there's a lot of sort of environmental services, I think, that could come out of it, of sort of ecological restoration. There's education opportunities, these sorts of things. There's a great program called TUBS in Houston, and I can't think of the acronym right now, but it does that with vacant places. It's a really good example, and I think it's a private-public partnership, but you can't on FEMA buyout properties. You can't rebuild, right? And so they're finding just really some interesting, innovative ways to use that space. A lot of it's for flood retention too, as well, and those sorts of things. One other thing too, though, is we're trying to find ways to. A lot of these communities are already under-resourced, but they have a lot of local knowledge. And they might not know, again, about how the buyout process works, but we feel like there's a lot of community capacity building by collaborating with locals and teaching them how to do land suitability analysis, for example, for a receiving community, and not in an extractive way, but learning what they know about the land as well, and then training them so there's employment opportunities as well. Anybody else?
Good. Other questions? We've got maybe time for one more question out there, I think. Yeah, someone's got the microphone. Okay. It's on.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
A lot of what you have discussed seems to require receptive minds as your audience to put these things together. and Louisiana now is the anchor of the nation in education. I have heard that there are a lot of companies that will not come here because they worry about a workforce not being available. There is a migration out of Louisiana in order to move places where you can get an adequate education. And the companies that will bring people into Louisiana do not wish to do so because they don't wish their families to be subjected to our education system. So I was interested in how, in all of your discussions, as far as a proactive planning, there is any focus on the educational system that Louisiana presently is dealing with that would need to be adjusted in order to move forward on a proactive basis and simply having a receptive audience that understands what you are talking about and can relate it past their individual circle of living.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think there's two pieces there. Are we educating our citizens to really understand the potential changes that we have in the future? And that's a huge question. And then the other question is, will businesses continue to move here? And I think that that is a different question, actually, apart from the education. And while workforce is a huge piece of business relocation decisions, it's not the only piece. And the other piece is like how many businesses that we grow here are from here rather than that we pull in from other pieces. So my background is actually in economic development prior to my role at the Blanco Center. And so, that's a big piece of it is like grow your own and then bring others in. And so I think the two questions that you're asking there are, one is like an economic development question about like which businesses are here and which will stay here. And the second one is, are we educating our citizens about the changes that we are seeing? So Siders, I don't know, as an educator, do you want to talk about like what you see in your undergrads when they're coming in? And I know they're not going to necessarily be Louisiana undergrads, but I think that any public university really gets a piece of like the public education system wherever we are. So at UL, we get a lot of students from Louisiana. You may have fewer, but you also get students that have been educated in a variety of public situations across your part of the country. So, thinking about undergrads, what are they seeing right now?
It's an interesting question about the receptive minds, and I don't know. Don't tell my boss, but I'm not sure that educating students on climate change is the issue, and this is why. I work in a disaster research center where, I work on climate change, but I have a colleague who works on pandemics and health issues, and I have another colleague who works on technological issues, right, and hazards and things like that, oil spills, other environmental issues. And I think they would argue, right, that they need education to teach people about health hazards, and that we need way more information about health and medicine and the next pandemic, and way more information about the threats of AI and technology and responsible use of the internet and et cetera, et cetera. And I would say climate change. But I think the reality is what we actually need is to teach people the underlying skills, like the critical thinking skills, the how to consume data and information, right? How to think about credible sources, how to think critically for themselves, because most people don't think about climate change on a daily basis, or sea level rise, or flooding, or insurance. And that's okay, right? Because they're probably thinking about something equally important, right? I'm not sure I want my doctor thinking about sea level rise at that moment, right? I kind of want them to be thinking about something else. But what I want them to be able to do is to read the news and think critically about what they're engaging with. And I think that goes to your point on receptive minds. I picked up on that phrase, because I think one of the bigger issues is not, do they understand climate change? It's, are we educating people to have receptive minds to new information so they can go through that learning, unlearning, relearning process throughout their lives with whatever life throws at them, whether that's a new financial crisis or a war or a pandemic or major sea level rise or a disaster. And so I've been thinking about that a lot recently, is that we need some people who are going to be experts in climate change, of course, but I'm more concerned about those underlying critical thinking skills. And so I've been trying to think a lot. I don't have a good answer for it, but I think that actually might be slightly less controversial, right? To say that we want to develop critical thinking skills. That's one of the things businesses, almost any business would say, what do we want in our employees? Critical thinking skills, right? And so I hope that that is an entry point where we could work on that doesn't have to be topic specific. Yeah, I'm not sure the Climate Change Hub will endorse that, but maybe that's my position anyway.
All right, with that, we're going to have to cut it off and pass it back to our CPEX friends for a few announcements.
Thank you. I would actually like to comment on this panel in addition to thanking everybody. I think applying the reframing idea maybe is to not think about receiving communities, but recruiting communities that could potentially solve some of the problems that we talked about today and maybe become less of a passive thing, and probably an amazing job for planners to implement. Okay, with that, thank you again. Again, for your professional credits, there's a continuing education table out there. I'd like to thank our sponsors who are listed in the programs and in the slideshows between the sessions. And it is lunchtime. So there's lunch out in the lobby. Have as much as you want. And there are additional sessions coming up. After lunch, there will be what you need to know about artificial intelligence in the field of planning. And in the workshop theater, we'll have Brighter Futures Leveraging Solar for Resilient Communities. All right, thank you.